The sun hung low over the dusty plains of Wyoming territory, casting long shadows across the endless expanse of sagebrush and rocky outcroppings. Samuel Crawford wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse along the familiar trail back to his ranch. At 52, he had spent the better part of 3 decades working this harsh but beautiful land, carving out a life from the unforgiving wilderness. Samuel's ranch sat in a valley between 2 ridges, a modest spread with a handful of cattle and horses that provided him with enough to survive, though little more. The isolation had been his choice after the war, when the memories of distant battlefields and fallen comrades had driven him to seek solace in the vast emptiness of the frontier. Here, among the rolling hills and endless sky, he had found a measure of peace, even if loneliness was his constant companion. As his horse picked its way down the rocky slope toward home, Samuel noticed something unusual in the distance. A figure stood tied to a gnarled oak tree near the creek that marked the eastern boundary of his property. His first instinct was caution. In this territory, strangers often meant trouble, whether they were outlaws, hostile warriors, or desperate settlers who had lost their way. Drawing closer, Samuel's weathered hands tightened on the reins as the scene became clearer. A young woman, perhaps no more than 18 or 19 years old, was bound to the ancient oak with rough rope. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her clothing bore the distinctive patterns and materials of Apache craftsmanship. Most disturbing of all was the crude wooden sign hanging around her neck, bearing words carved in unsteady letters, "Love condemns." Samuel dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry grass as he approached. The girl's eyes followed his movement, dark and defiant despite her obvious exhaustion. There was no fear in her gaze, only a fierce pride that reminded him of the wild mustangs he had tried to break in his younger days. Some creatures, he had learned, were never meant to be tamed. "Easy there," Samuel said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm going to cut you loose." The girl said nothing, but her eyes tracked his every movement as he drew his knife and carefully cut through the ropes that bound her wrists and ankles. The bindings had been tight, leaving angry red marks on her bronze skin. As the last rope fell away, she stumbled forward, catching herself against the tree trunk. Samuel stepped back, giving her space while keeping his hands visible. "Can you understand me?" he asked in English. Then tried again with the few Apache words he had picked up over the years from trading with peaceful bands that sometimes passed through the territory. She straightened slowly, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had cut into her flesh. When she spoke, it was in clear, accented English. "I understand you, white man." Her voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and wariness, but also something else that Samuel recognized from his own reflection in the mirror each morning. A deep, bone-deep loneliness that spoke of losses too great to bear. "Who did this to you?" Samuel asked, gesturing toward the discarded ropes and the sign that now lay in the dirt. The girl's jaw tightened, and for a moment Samuel thought she would not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My own people. My tribe." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Samuel had lived on the frontier long enough to know that Apache justice could be swift and harsh, but he had never heard of such a punishment being inflicted on one so young. There had to be more to the story, layers of pain and conflict that he could only guess at. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Again she hesitated before answering. "Aiyana. It means eternal blossom in my language." Samuel nodded slowly. "I'm Samuel Crawford. This is my land you're on, but you're welcome to it as long as you need." He gestured toward his ranch house, visible in the distance. "You look like you could use some food and water. Maybe some rest." Aiyana's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you help me? You do not know what I have done, what they say I have done." Samuel considered her question, looking at this young woman who had been cast out by her own people and left to die in the wilderness. He thought of his own isolation, his own exile from the world of men, chosen rather than imposed. Perhaps that was what moved him to speak the truth. "Because I know what it's like to be alone," he said simply. "And because whatever you did or didn't do, no one deserves to die tied to a tree like an animal." For the first time since he had found her, something flickered in Aiyana's dark eyes. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of hope. She looked toward his ranch house, then back at his weathered face, as if trying to read his intentions in the lines carved there by years of sun and solitude. Finally, she nodded once, a barely perceptible movement of her head. The walk to Samuel's ranch house passed in tense silence. broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the dry earth and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the evening. Aiyana moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with the wilderness, but Samuel noticed the slight tremor in her legs, the way she favored her left side, where bruises darkened her ribs beneath the torn fabric of her dress. Samuel's home was modest, but sturdy, built from timber he had cut himself and stones gathered from the creek bed. A wide porch wrapped around the front, offering shade during the brutal summer heat and protection from winter storms. Inside, the main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and shelves lined with books that had traveled with him from his previous life back east. "Sit," Samuel said, gesturing toward a chair beside the kitchen table. "I'll get you some water and food." Aiyana remained standing, her dark eyes scanning the room as if memorizing every detail, every possible exit. Her wariness was understandable, Samuel thought. Trust would have to be earned, not commanded. He filled a tin cup with water from the pump and set it on the table, then moved to the pantry to gather supplies for a simple meal. As he worked, cutting bread and slicing cold meat left over from yesterday's dinner, he found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. In the lamplight, he could see the full extent of her ordeal more clearly. Her Apache dress, beautifully crafted with intricate beadwork and traditional designs, was torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. Her long black hair, which would normally have been braided and adorned according to tribal custom, hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Most troubling were the fresh cuts on her arms and the purple bruises that marked her throat, suggesting the punishment she had endured went far beyond simple banishment. "You should drink," Samuel said quietly, nodding toward the untouched cup of water. Aiyana's eyes met his for a moment before she reached for the cup. She drank slowly, as if savoring each sip, but her posture remained rigid, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Samuel placed a plate of food before her and took a seat across the table, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "When did you last eat?" he asked. 3 days, she replied, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "Maybe 4. Time becomes unclear when you expect to die." The casual way she spoke of her own mortality struck Samuel like a physical blow. He had seen death in war, had watched good men fall in distant battles, but there was something particularly cruel about the abandonment this young woman had endured. "What happened to you, Aiyana?" he asked gently. "What did they accuse you of?" For a long moment she said nothing, mechanically eating small bites of bread and meat as if her body moved independently of her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I loved someone I should not have loved," she said. "Someone forbidden by the laws of my people." Samuel waited, sensing there was more to the story. The sign around her neck had read, "Love condemns," and now her words began to make terrible sense. "He was not Apache," she continued, staring down at her plate. "He was Mexican, a trader who came to our camp with goods from the south. His name was Diego, and he had kind eyes and gentle hands that knew how to work silver into beautiful things." She touched her throat where a necklace might once have hung, a gesture so unconscious and full of longing that Samuel felt his heart tighten with unexpected sympathy. "The Council of Elders discovered our attachment," Aiyana continued. "They said I had brought shame upon our people by lying with an outsider. They said my actions endangered the purity of our bloodline and violated the sacred ways of our ancestors." Samuel had heard similar stories before, though rarely did they end so harshly. Many tribes had complex rules about marriage and relationships, particularly in times of conflict when trust of outsiders ran thin. "What happened to him?" Samuel asked. "To Diego?" Aiyana's hands clenched into fists on the table. "They killed him, tortured him first, to make him confess that he had bewitched me, that he had used dark magic to turn me against my own people. He died protecting me, claiming that our love was his doing alone, that I bore no responsibility for what had happened between us." The weight of her grief filled the small room like a physical presence. Samuel had seen that kind of pain before, in the eyes of widows and orphans left behind by war. It was a wound that cut deeper than flesh, scarring the very soul. "The council wanted to kill me as well," she continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "But my uncle, who sits among the elders, convinced them that exile would be a greater punishment. He said death would make me a martyr, but abandonment would make me a warning to other young women who might consider betraying their people for love. Samuel leaned back in his chair, processing the full horror of what she had endured. To lose the man she loved and then be cast out by her own family and tribe. It was a cruelty that spoke to the worst aspects of human nature, the fear and hatred that could turn love itself into a crime. "So they tied you to that tree and left you to die," he said. Aiyana nodded, "with that sign around my neck, so that anyone who found my body would know why I had been punished. A lesson carved in wood and flesh." The days that followed fell into a careful rhythm, with Samuel and Aiyana moving around each other like wary dancers, each respecting the other's need for space, while slowly building the fragile foundation of trust. Samuel had offered her the small spare room at the back of the house, a simple space with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the valley. She accepted his hospitality with quiet dignity, neither effusive in her gratitude nor resentful of her dependence. Samuel found himself making subtle changes to his daily routine to accommodate his guest. He rose earlier to complete his morning chores before she woke, giving her privacy to wash and dress. He left food on the kitchen table before heading out to tend his cattle, and when he returned in the evenings, he often found that she had cleaned the dishes and swept the floors, her way of contributing to the household without being asked. Communication between them remained stilted and careful. Aiyana spoke only when necessary, and Samuel, who had grown comfortable with solitude over the years, struggled to find words that might ease her obvious pain. Yet gradually, small moments of connection began to emerge. On the fourth morning, Samuel found her standing beside the corral, watching his horses with the keen attention of someone who understood the animals' language. One of his mares, a temperamental chestnut that usually shied away from strangers, had approached the fence and was allowing Aiyana to stroke her neck. "She's beautiful," Aiyana said as Samuel approached, the first words she had spoken that weren't directly related to necessity or survival. "Luna," Samuel replied, leaning against the fence rail. "I've had her for 3 years, but she's never taken to anyone like that before. You have a way with horses." A ghost of a smile touched Aiyana's lips. "My father taught me to ride before I could properly walk. He said horses could see into a person's heart, that they knew whether someone carried peace or violence in their spirit." It was the first time she had mentioned her family beyond the uncle who had helped condemn her, and Samuel sensed an opening in the walls she had built around herself. "What was he like?" Samuel asked gently. "Your father." The question hung in the air for a long moment, and Samuel worried he had pushed too hard, too soon. Then Aiyana began to speak, her voice soft with memory. "He was a warrior, but not in the way white men think of warriors. He fought when he had to protect our people, but he was also a healer, a keeper of stories. He could gentle a wild horse with whispers, and he knew which plants could cure fever, and which could ease the pain of childbirth." She paused, her hand still moving in slow circles on Luna's neck. "He died 2 winters ago, during the harsh cold that killed so many of our elders. Before he passed, he told me that love was the greatest medicine, that it could heal wounds that no herb or ritual could touch." Samuel felt the irony of those words, given what had happened to her. Love had been her downfall, the very thing that had led to her exile and the death of the man she had cared for. "He sounds like a wise man," Samuel said. "He was, but his wisdom could not save me from my own choices or protect me from the judgment of others." Aiyana's voice carried a note of bitter regret. "Sometimes I wonder if he would be ashamed of me now, cast out and dependent on the kindness of a stranger." Samuel considered his words carefully before responding. "I think any father who taught his daughter about love and healing would understand that the heart doesn't always follow the rules others set for it. Shame belongs to those who would punish someone for caring too much, not to the person who dared to love." Aiyana turned to look at him then, really look at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time since he had found her tied to that tree. In her dark eyes, Samuel saw a flicker of something he hadn't expected. Curiosity about this weathered rancher who spoke of love and understanding with the conviction of someone who had known both intimately. "You speak as if you know something about forbidden love," she said. Samuel felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the old pain that he had carried with him to this isolated valley. He had shared his story with no one in the years since arriving in Wyoming, but something about Aiyana's situation, her courage in the face of judgment and loss, made him want to offer her the gift of his own vulnerability. "I was married once," he said slowly, "back in Ohio before the war. Her name was Catherine, and she was the daughter of a prominent family in town. We met at a church social, and I knew from the first moment I saw her that she was the woman I wanted to spend my life with." He paused, watching as Luna wandered away from the fence to graze, leaving him and Aiyana alone with the weight of shared confidences. "When the war came, I enlisted like so many other young men, full of ideals about duty and honor. I promised Catherine I would come back to her, that we would build a life together when the fighting was done. She promised to wait for me, no matter how long it took." The memories came flooding back as he spoke. Catherine's face on their wedding day, 6 months before he left for the war. Her letters that sustained him through the darkest days of battle. The dreams that kept him alive when death seemed preferable to the hell of combat. "She did wait," Samuel continued, "for 2 years, while I fought in places with names like Antietam and Gettysburg. But when I came home, I was changed. The things I had seen, the things I had done in the name of duty, they had poisoned something inside me. I couldn't sleep without nightmares, couldn't hear a loud noise without reaching for a weapon that wasn't there." Samuel's confession hung between them like morning mist over the creek, fragile and revealing. Aiyana remained silent, but her posture had shifted slightly, leaning toward him with the unconscious attention of someone who recognized familiar pain in another's words. "Catherine tried to help me," Samuel continued, his weathered hands gripping the fence rail. "She was patient and kind, everything a man could ask for in a wife. But I could see the fear growing in her eyes when I would wake screaming in the night, when I would duck at the sound of thunder, when I would sit staring at nothing for hours at a time." The words came easier now, as if a dam had burst inside him after years of holding back the flood. "Her family began to pressure her to have the marriage annulled. They said I was unfit to be a husband, that the war had broken me beyond repair. They weren't wrong, though it hurt to hear it spoken aloud." Aiyana's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "What did you do?" "I made the choice for her," Samuel said, the old pain evident in his voice. "One morning, I packed what little I owned and left her a letter explaining that she deserved better than a broken man who might never heal. I told her she was free to find the love and happiness she deserved, that I would not burden her with my damaged spirit." He turned to look at Aiyana directly. "I came west to find solitude, to spare everyone I cared about from the wreckage I had become. I thought love was something I had forfeited on the battlefields, something I no longer deserved to give or receive." The parallel between their stories was clear. Both had lost love, though through very different circumstances. Both had been judged and found wanting by the expectations of others. Both had chosen or been forced into exile from the lives they had known. "Do you ever regret leaving her?" Aiyana asked. Samuel considered the question seriously. "Every day for the first few years. Less often now, but the regret never completely goes away. I sometimes wonder if she remarried, if she found the peaceful life she deserved. I hope she did." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the horses graze in the afternoon sun. The confession had created a new understanding between them, a recognition that they were both refugees from lives that had asked too much of their hearts. "You're Diego," Samuel said eventually. "Tell me about him. What was he like?" Aiyana's face softened at the mention of his name. "He was gentle in a way that surprised me. Mexican traders who came to our territory were usually hard men, weathered by travel and suspicious of everyone they met. But Diego was different. He spoke to our children with kindness, treated our elders with respect, and when he looked at the silver jewelry he crafted, his eyes held the same reverence my grandfather showed when handling sacred objects." She paused, lost in memory. "He taught me Spanish words while I taught him Apache phrases. We would meet by the river when he visited, ostensibly so I could translate for other women who wanted to trade, but really just to talk. He told me stories about his home in Sonora, about orange groves and markets filled with flowers, about a world beyond the harsh beauty of our desert homeland." Samuel could hear the love in her voice, the way it lingered on certain words and phrases. It reminded him of how he had once spoken about Catherine before the war had changed everything. "He wanted to take me south with him," Aiyana continued. "He said his family would welcome me, that love was the same in any language, but I was afraid to leave my people, afraid to abandon everything I had ever known for an uncertain future with a man I had known for only a few months." "But you loved him," Samuel said. "It was not a question. Yes, she whispered. I loved him enough to risk everything, but not enough to choose him over my family when the moment came to decide. And that hesitation, that moment of doubt, cost us both everything. Samuel understood that particular torment, the weight of choices made and unmade, the terrible arithmetic of love that asked impossible questions about loyalty and sacrifice. When the council discovered our relationship, Aiyana continued, Diego came to the tribal gathering to speak for both of us. He stood before men who could barely understand his words and tried to explain that our love was pure, that he meant no disrespect to our ways or our people. He offered to undergo whatever rituals or trials they demanded to prove his worthiness. Her voice grew thick with emotion, but they had already decided our fate. The elders said that no outsider could be trusted, especially not during times when other tribes were being forced onto reservations by the white soldiers. They said any Apache woman who gave her heart to a foreigner was a traitor to her own blood. The cruelty of it struck Samuel anew. In their different ways, both he and Aiyana had been punished for loving deeply, for daring to reach beyond the narrow boundaries that others had drawn around their lives. I dream about him sometimes, Aiyana said quietly. I dream that we escaped together, that we found a place where no one cared about the color of our skin or the languages we spoke. In those dreams, we grow old together, and our children learn to speak both Apache and Spanish, to honor both sides of their heritage. Samuel nodded, understanding the bittersweet comfort of such dreams. I used to dream about Catherine too. In my dreams, the war never happened, or I came home unchanged. We had the farm we planned, the children we talked about in our letters. They shared another moment of silence, two souls bound by the common experience of loss and exile. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Samuel why he had chosen this harsh but beautiful land for his sanctuary. The weeks passed with increasing ease between Samuel and Aiyana, their shared understanding deepening into something that resembled friendship. She began to help him with the ranch work, demonstrating skills that impressed him with their precision and effectiveness. Her knowledge of plants proved invaluable when one of his cattle developed an infection, and she prepared a poultice from prairie herbs that healed the animal faster than any remedy Samuel had tried before. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Sometimes they talked about their past lives, sharing memories both painful and sweet. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. Samuel noticed the gradual changes in Aiyana as the days grew shorter and autumn approached. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something that might have been hope. She laughed occasionally now, usually at the antics of his younger horses, or when he shared stories about his more spectacular failures as a rancher. The sound of her laughter was like music in the isolated valley, a reminder that joy could survive even the darkest trials. One morning in early October, Samuel found her standing at the edge of his property, gazing south toward the distant mountains where her people might still be camped. She had been doing this more frequently lately, and he sensed she was wrestling with a decision about her future. "Do you miss them?" he asked, joining her at the wooden fence he had built to mark the boundary of his land. "Some of them," she admitted. "I miss my younger sister, who was always getting into trouble for asking too many questions about things women were not supposed to wonder about. I miss my grandmother, who taught me to weave baskets and told me stories about the old days when our people roamed freely across all these lands." She paused, her dark eyes fixed on the horizon. "But I do not miss the fear, the constant watching and judging, the way every choice had to be measured against traditions that seemed designed more to control than to guide." Samuel understood that sentiment. His own departure from Ohio had been motivated partly by a similar desire to escape the suffocating expectations of a society that valued conformity over authenticity. "What will you do when winter comes?" he asked gently. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you like, but I know this isolation isn't natural for someone who grew up in a community." Aiyana turned to face him, and Samuel was struck by the transformation that had taken place over the past months. The desperate, broken woman he had found tied to that oak tree had evolved into someone stronger, more self-assured. The terrible grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer defined her entirely. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "There is a trading post 2 days' ride north of here, run by a French trapper named Beaumont and his Shoshone wife. They are known for being fair to all people, regardless of their background. I thought I might go there, see if they need help with translation or healing work." The idea filled Samuel with an unexpected sense of loss. Over the months they had shared his ranch, Aiyana had become more than just a guest or even a friend. She had become a vital presence in his life, someone whose companionship had eased the loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years. "That sounds like a good plan," he said, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. "When would you leave?" "Before the first snow," she replied. "I need to establish myself before winter makes travel impossible." "But Samuel—" She hesitated, then continued with obvious difficulty. "I want you to know that these months with you have given me something I thought I had lost forever." "What's that?" "The ability to trust again, to believe that there are people in this world who will show kindness without expecting anything in return, who will judge others by their character rather than their bloodline or their past mistakes." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You gave me something too, Aiyana. You reminded me that isolation isn't the same as healing, that running from pain doesn't make it disappear." They stood together in the morning light, both aware that their time together was drawing to a close. The friendship they had built would survive their separation, but the daily rhythms they had established, the quiet companionship that had sustained them both, would soon become just another memory. "There's something else I want to tell you," Aiyana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I first found myself tied to that tree, waiting to die, I thought love was truly a curse, something that brought only pain and destruction to those foolish enough to believe in it." Samuel waited for her to continue, sensing the importance of what she was about to say. "But watching you, seeing the way you've chosen to live your life with honor and kindness despite your own losses, has taught me that love condemned me only when I was too afraid to fully embrace it. Diego and I were punished not because our love was wrong, but because others were too frightened of change to accept something beautiful and pure." Her words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, the kind of understanding that could only come from surviving the worst life had to offer and choosing to find meaning in the struggle. "Maybe that's the real lesson," Samuel said thoughtfully. "Not that love is dangerous, but that fear is what makes it so. Fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of change." Aiyana nodded. "I think my father would have understood that. I think he would have been proud that his daughter chose love over fear, even when the cost was everything she had ever known." 3 years later, Samuel Crawford stood on his familiar porch watching the sunrise paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and rose. The ranch had prospered in ways he had never expected. Not just financially, but in spirit. What had once been a refuge from the world had become something warmer, a true home. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention to the trail leading up from the valley. 2 riders were making their way toward his ranch, and as they drew closer, Samuel's weathered face broke into a smile that transformed his entire expression. Aiyana rode the lead horse with the same fluid grace he remembered, but she was no longer alone. Beside her rode a man Samuel had never met, but had heard much about in her letters. Thomas Beaumont, the half-French, half-Crow trader, who had become her partner in both business and life. "Samuel," Aiyana called out as they approached, her voice carrying joy and excitement across the morning air. She dismounted with practiced ease and embraced him warmly, the gesture natural and unguarded in a way that spoke of genuine friendship maintained across distance and time. Thomas followed her lead, extending his hand with the open manner of someone who had heard many good things about the rancher who had sheltered his wife during her darkest hour. "It's good to see you again," Samuel said, studying Aiyana's face. The years had been kind to her. The haunted look that had marked her features when he first found her was gone entirely, replaced by the confident bearing of a woman who had found her place in the world. "And this must be Thomas," Samuel continued, shaking the younger man's hand. "I've heard so much about you in Aiyana's letters that I feel I know you already." Thomas smiled, his weathered face creasing with good humor. "She's told me stories about you too, my friend. How you saved her life when she had given up hope. How you taught her that kindness still existed in the world." They spent the morning catching up over coffee and the simple breakfast Samuel prepared. Aiyana and Thomas shared stories of their life at the trading post, which had become a successful enterprise that served travelers, trappers, and various tribal groups across the territory. Aiyana had become known as a skilled healer and translator, while Thomas handled the business side of their operations, with fairness and integrity that had earned them respect from all corners of the frontier community. "We've come to ask you something," Aiyana said as they sat on the porch after the meal, watching Samuel's horses graze in the pasture. "Thomas and I are planning to expand our operation, to build a proper trading post and settlement where people of all backgrounds can come together in peace. We want to create the kind of place where love doesn't have to hide, where families like ours can thrive without fear of judgment." Samuel nodded, intrigued by the vision they were describing. It sounded like the sort of community he had once dreamed of, but never thought possible in the harsh realities of frontier life. "We need partners," Thomas continued. "People who understand what it means to build something from nothing, who believe in the idea that different peoples can live and work together in harmony. We thought of you immediately." The offer touched Samuel more deeply than he could easily express. After years of solitude, the idea of being part of a larger community, of contributing to something meaningful and lasting, held tremendous appeal. "What would you need from me?" he asked. "Your cattle operation could supply beef to the trading post and the settlement we're planning," Aiyana explained. "But more than that, we need your wisdom, your steady presence. You've built something good here, Samuel. We want to help you expand it into something even better." As they talked through the details of their proposal, Samuel found himself thinking about the strange turns life had taken. 3 years ago, he had been a hermit, convinced that his best days were behind him, that isolation was his only option. The discovery of Aiyana tied to that oak tree had changed everything, not just for her, but for him as well. "There's something else," Aiyana said, her voice taking on a note of particular warmth. "Thomas and I are expecting our first child in the spring. We want our son or daughter to grow up knowing Uncle Samuel, the man who taught their mother that hope can survive even the darkest times." The news filled Samuel with a joy so profound it surprised him. The idea that he would be part of this child's life, that his story would be woven into the fabric of a new generation, gave his own existence a meaning he had never imagined possible. "I'd be honored," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. As the sun reached its zenith, they walked together through Samuel's property, discussing the practical details of their partnership. But underneath the talk of cattle drives and supply routes, there was something deeper happening, the forging of a new kind of family, bound not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual respect. That evening, as Aiyana and Thomas prepared to make camp before beginning their journey home the next morning, she pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. "Do you remember what you told me that first night when you found me by the oak tree?" she asked. Samuel thought back to that distant evening, to the broken woman he had untied from those cruel ropes. "I said that whatever you had done, no one deserved to die alone like that." "No," she said, smiling. "You said you knew what it was like to be alone, and that you helped me because of that understanding. But Samuel, you were wrong about something." "What was that?" "You thought you were saving me from loneliness," she said. "But what really happened was that we saved each other. The sign around my neck said, 'Love condemns.' But what we discovered together is that love redeems. It transforms isolation into connection, despair into hope, endings into new beginnings." As Samuel watched his friends ride away the next morning, heading back to their life at the trading post, he carried with him the knowledge that his own story was far from over. The lonely rancher who had once believed himself broken beyond repair had become part of something larger and more beautiful than he had ever dared imagine. Love, he reflected, did not condemn after all. It simply asked for the courage to begin again. The end.